The USS Virginia sliced through the dark waters of Pearl Harbor just after dawn, its black hull barely breaking the surface as it approached the dock. Inside the cramped berthing area, 23 naval cadets stood at attention, their uniforms so new they still had the factory creases pressed into the fabric. This was their first real deployment, their first time stepping aboard an actual attack submarine instead of the training simulators back at Annapolis. The air was thick with nervous energy and the metallic smell that seemed to seep from every surface of the sub. Cadet Jackson Martinez stood near the bulkhead, trying to look more confident than he felt, watching as the senior officers moved through their pre-departure checks with mechanical precision. He'd graduated top of his class, earned every commendation available, and now here he was, about to embark on a 6-month patrol that would take them deep into the Pacific. The hatch above them groaned open, sending a shaft of morning light down into the dim interior. One by one the final crew members descended the ladder, each one carrying their gear with the practiced ease of veterans. Then came the old man. He appeared at the top of the hatch like some kind of mistake, a clerical error made flesh. His clothes were civilian, a faded blue windbreaker over a plain grey shirt, and he moved down the ladder with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints didn't work quite like they used to. His duffel bag was ancient, canvas worn soft with age, and covered in stains that spoke of decades of use. Martinez caught the eye of Cadet Thompson beside him, and Thompson's lip curled into a smirk. Around them, other cadets were having similar reactions, trying to stifle their laughter, exchanging glances that said the same thing without words. What was this old guy doing here? Was he lost? Did he think this was some kind of tourist attraction? The man's silver hair was cut military short, but that was the only thing military about him. His face was deeply lined, weathered like old leather left too long in the sun. He had to be 70, maybe older. Martinez watched as the old man reached the bottom of the ladder and stood there for a moment, seeming to get his bearings in the tight space. A few of the cadets couldn't hold back anymore, and soft chuckles rippled through their group. One of them, Cadet Pierce, whispered just loud enough to be heard, "Someone's grandpa got on the wrong boat." The laughter spread like a current through water. Even Martinez felt his shoulders shaking with suppressed amusement. This was absurd. They were about to head out on one of the most sophisticated pieces of military hardware ever created, and some elderly civilian had wandered aboard like he was looking for the bathroom at a shopping mall. The old man didn't seem to notice their reaction, or if he did, he gave no indication. He just stood there, duffel bag hanging from one gnarled hand, his eyes moving slowly across the cramped space as if he were seeing it for the first time, or maybe remembering something from long ago. Captain Rachel Diaz appeared from the forward compartment like a force of nature compressed into 5 feet 6 inches of pure authority. Her working uniform was pristine despite the early hour, and her dark eyes swept across the assembled cadets with the kind of intensity that could strip paint off a bulkhead. She'd been commanding submarines for 12 years, had served on 4 different boats, and she could read a crew's temperature faster than sonar could ping a contact. Right now the temperature was all wrong. The laughter died in stages, like dominoes falling in reverse, as each cadet realized the captain had entered the space. But by then it was too late. She'd heard them. She'd seen the smirks, the nudges, the casual disrespect that her cadets were showing to the old man who now stood quietly near the ladder, apparently waiting for something. Diaz's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell that her executive officer would have recognized as the moment before a storm. Martinez felt his stomach drop. He'd never actually been dressed down by a commanding officer before, had sailed through his training on a wave of perfect grades and glowing recommendations, but he could sense something building in the air, some shift in pressure that had nothing to do with the submarine systems. The captain walked slowly toward them, her boots making precise clicks on the deck plating. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. She stopped directly in front of the group, her gaze moving from face to face, taking in each cadet individually, making sure they all felt seen. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse than if she'd shouted. "I want to know," she said, each word dropping into the silence like a stone into still water, "what exactly you find so amusing about a man who has given more to the United States Navy than all of you combined will likely give in your entire careers." The cadets shifted uncomfortably. Martinez felt heat rising up his neck, that familiar burn of shame that came with knowing you'd done something wrong but not yet understanding the full scope of your mistake. Thompson, standing beside him, had gone pale. The captain continued, her voice still dangerously soft. This man has forgotten more about submarines than you will ever learn. He has served in conditions that would break you in half. He has made decisions that saved lives while you were still learning your multiplication tables." She paused, letting that sink in, and you laughed at him. Behind them, the old man still hadn't moved. He stood there with his duffel bag, his weathered face neutral, showing nothing. But Martinez noticed something now that he'd missed before. The way the man stood, despite his age, despite the careful movements, there was something in his posture that spoke of years of discipline. The set of his shoulders, the way his eyes took in everything without seeming to look directly at anything. Captain Diaz turned slightly, acknowledging the old man for the first time since entering the compartment. Her entire demeanor changed. The hard edge in her voice softened, though it lost none of its authority. There was something else there now, something that made Martinez's chest tighten with growing dread about just how badly he'd misread this situation. The captain raised her hand in a crisp salute. Every cadet in the compartment froze, their training warring with their confusion. "You saluted officers. You saluted the flag. You didn't salute elderly civilians who boarded submarines in windbreakers and carried beat-up duffel bags." But Captain Diaz held that salute, her arm rigid and perfect, her eyes locked on the old man's face. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating in the recycled air of the submarine. Martinez could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The old man's expression didn't change immediately. He looked at Captain Diaz for a long moment, as if considering whether to acknowledge the salute or simply let it hang there in the stale air. Then slowly, with movements that spoke of muscle memory older than most of the cadets in the room, he brought his hand up in a return salute. It was perfect, crisp, precise, executed with a clarity that cut through the confusion like a knife. This wasn't the gesture of someone who'd learned to salute once and forgotten the finer points. This was the salute of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, in 100 different situations, until it became as natural as breathing. Captain Diaz lowered her arm, and when she spoke again, her voice carried through the compartment with crystal clarity. "Cadets, allow me to introduce Admiral James Hartford, United States Navy, retired." The words hit Martinez like a physical blow. Admiral, the old man in the worn windbreaker was an admiral. His mind raced through the implications, through the crushing weight of his own stupidity, through the sick realization that he'd just laughed at one of the most senior officers in the entire naval hierarchy, retired or not. Around him, his fellow cadets were going through similar calculations, their faces showing varying degrees of horror. Thompson looked like he might actually be sick. Pierce, who'd made the grandpa comment, had gone from pale to grey. Admiral Hartford lowered his hand and finally spoke. His voice was rough, gravelly, the kind of voice that came from decades of shouting orders over engine noise and speaking calmly during emergencies. "At ease," he said, even though none of them had actually come to attention. It was more of a general statement, an attempt to release some of the crushing tension that had settled over the compartment like a weight, but none of the cadets moved. Martinez couldn't have moved if he'd wanted to. His muscles had locked up, his body frozen in this moment of absolute humiliation. Captain Diaz continued, her tone still carrying that edge of controlled anger. "Admiral Hartford served for 42 years in the submarine service. He commanded the USS Pittsburgh during the Cold War, ran silent patrols that are still classified, and was instrumental in developing many of the protocols and procedures that keep you safe on this boat." She paused, letting that information settle. After retirement, he spent 15 years teaching at the Naval War College, shaping the minds of officers who would go on to command their own vessels. The admiral shifted his duffel bag from one hand to the other, a simple gesture that somehow made him seem more human and more formidable at the same time. "He's joining us," Captain Diaz said, "as an observer on this patrol, to assess our readiness and provide guidance based on his decades of experience." She looked at each cadet again, making sure they understood the full scope of what they'd done. "And you laughed at him." Martinez wanted to disappear. He wanted the deck to open up and swallow him whole. He'd spent 4 years at Annapolis dreaming of this moment, of serving on a submarine, of proving himself worthy of the uniform and everything it represented, and in less than 5 minutes aboard an actual boat, he'd revealed himself to be exactly the kind of ignorant, arrogant fool that had no business wearing that uniform. Admiral Hartford cleared his throat softly. "Captain," he said, his gravelly voice carrying a note of something that might have been amusement, "I think these young people have learned their lesson." Diaz didn't look convinced, but she nodded slightly. "Yes, sir." The admiral looked at the assembled cadets, his eyes moving across their faces with the same careful attention the captain had shown earlier. but where her gaze had been hard and cutting, his was more thoughtful, measuring. Martinez had the uncomfortable feeling of being weighed and found wanting. The submarine pulled away from the dock 3 hours later, the massive vessel sliding into deeper water with barely a ripple on the surface. Martinez had been assigned to the sonar station for the first watch, which meant sitting in a chair that was designed for someone 6 inches shorter and staring at screens that showed nothing but empty ocean. He was grateful for the assignment. It meant he didn't have to face the admiral, didn't have to confront the shame that was still burning in his chest like acid, but the submarine was a small world, and there was no hiding for long. Admiral Hartford appeared in the sonar room during the second hour of Martinez's watch, moving through the narrow space with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where every pipe and valve was located. He didn't announce himself, didn't make a production of his presence. He simply appeared, like a ghost materializing from the shadows, and stood behind Martinez's station watching the screens over his shoulder. Martinez's hands started to sweat. He was hyper-aware of every movement he made, every minor adjustment to the equipment, convinced he was about to make some catastrophic mistake that would prove he was as incompetent as his earlier behavior had suggested. The admiral watched in silence for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes. Then he spoke, his gravelly voice soft enough that it wouldn't carry beyond the immediate area. "What are you hearing?" Martinez swallowed hard. "Nothing, sir. Just ambient ocean noise, some biologics, but no contacts." Hartford made a small sound that could have been approval or skepticism. "Play it back. The section from about 4 minutes ago." Martinez's fingers fumbled slightly on the controls, but he managed to cue up the right segment. The admiral leaned in slightly, his head cocked to one side, listening with an intensity that made Martinez realize he'd been doing this all wrong. He'd been watching the screens, relying on the visual representation of the sonar data, but Admiral Hartford was listening, really listening, to the actual sounds beneath them. "There," the admiral said, pointing to a spot on the screen that corresponded to a slight fluctuation in the noise pattern. "That's not biological, that's mechanical, probably a fishing vessel, running slow, maybe 8 or 9 miles distant." Martinez stared at the screen, then listened again to the audio. He couldn't hear anything that sounded mechanical, just the constant wash of ocean sounds, the creaks and groans of the deep, the clicking of shrimp. Hartford must have seen the confusion on his face. "Your ears aren't trained yet," he said, not unkindly. "It takes years to develop the sensitivity. The equipment can show you what's there, but understanding what you're seeing, that requires experience." He pointed to another section of the display. "You're too focused on finding something obvious, a big contact, a clear signature, but the ocean doesn't work that way. Everything out here is subtle. Everything is hiding in noise." For the next 30 minutes, Admiral Hartford walked Martinez through the fundamentals of sonar interpretation, not from a textbook perspective, but from the hard-earned wisdom of someone who'd spent decades in these dark waters. He talked about how temperature layers affected sound propagation, how different types of vessels had different acoustic signatures, how even the time of day could change what you heard beneath the waves. Martinez listened, really listened, and slowly began to understand just how much he didn't know. All his training, all his perfect grades, they'd given him a foundation, but they hadn't given him this deep understanding that came from living with the technology, from making mistakes and learning from them, from spending years in the constant twilight of submarine duty. The emergency came on the 3rd day of patrol, screaming through the boat's communication system at 3 in the morning. "Fire in the engine room! Fire in the engine room! All hands to emergency stations!" Martinez bolted from his rack, his body moving on autopilot through the narrow passages, his mind still foggy with interrupted sleep. Around him, the submarine transformed into controlled chaos. Crew members rushed to their assigned positions, voices calling out status reports, the smell of smoke beginning to filter through the ventilation system. He reached his station in the damage control party, grabbing equipment with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline and fear. This was real. This wasn't a drill. Fire on a submarine was one of the worst-case scenarios, something that could turn a vessel into a coffin in minutes if not handled correctly. The smoke was getting thicker now, making his eyes water, making each breath burn slightly in his lungs. He could hear Captain Diaz's voice over the comm system, calm and authoritative, directing the response with practiced precision. Next to him, Cadet Thompson was struggling with a breathing apparatus, his hands fumbling with the straps, panic starting to show in his eyes. Martinez moved to help him, his own training finally kicking in properly, muscle memory overriding the fear. They got the apparatus secured. Just as the order came to advance toward the engine room, the next 20 minutes were a blur of heat and smoke and controlled terror. Martinez found himself doing things he'd only practiced in simulators, fighting a fire that seemed determined to consume the entire aft section of the submarine, working alongside crew members who moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of drills and training. Through the smoke and chaos, he caught glimpses of Admiral Hartford. The old man had appeared in the passageway, not getting in the way but not hiding either. He stood near the bulkhead, watching everything with those sharp eyes, his weathered face showing no sign of panic or concern, just observation, calculation, the steady presence of someone who'd been through this before and knew how it would end. Then suddenly the smoke began to clear. The fire was under control, beaten back by the damage control teams, reduced to smoldering metal and the acrid stink of burnt insulation. Captain Diaz's voice came over the comm again. Fire is contained. All teams report status. Martinez leaned against the bulkhead, his breathing apparatus fogged with condensation, his uniform soaked with sweat. His hands were shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a wave. Admiral Hartford walked past him, moving toward the engine room to inspect the damage. As he passed, he paused, looking at Martinez with those measuring eyes. "You did well," he said simply, then continued on his way. Those 3 words hit harder than any reprimand could have. Martinez watched the Admiral disappear into the smoke-stained passageway, and something inside his chest loosened slightly. Later, after the emergency had been fully resolved, after the damage had been assessed and the reports had been filed, Martinez learned the truth. It had been a drill, an incredibly realistic, unannounced drill that Captain Diaz had coordinated with the Admiral's input. They'd used smoke generators and carefully controlled small fires to simulate a real emergency, testing the crew's response under pressure. Some of the veteran crew members had known immediately that it was a drill, had spotted the telltale signs, but none of the cadets had figured it out. They'd all believed they were fighting for their lives. That evening, Admiral Hartford sat in the crew's mess, a cup of terrible submarine coffee in his gnarled hands, and told them about the Pittsburgh. The cadets had gathered around him, not because they were ordered to, but because word had spread that the Admiral was in a talkative mood, and everyone knew that these opportunities were rare and precious. Martinez sat at the edge of the group, still processing everything that had happened during the drill, still feeling the residual shake in his hands from the adrenaline. The Admiral took a sip of coffee, made a face that suggested he'd tasted better things in his life, and began to speak. "Winter of 1984, he said, his gravelly voice carrying easily in the small space. "We were running silent in the Barents Sea, shadowing a Soviet ballistic missile submarine. This was before the wall came down, before any of you were born, when the Cold War was still very real and very dangerous." He paused, his eyes getting that distant look that came with remembering things from decades past. "We'd been trailing them for 6 days, staying just outside their detection range, recording everything, their acoustic signature, their patrol patterns, their communication protocols, intelligence gold, the kind of data that could shift the balance of power if things ever went hot." Martinez leaned forward slightly, drawn into the story despite himself. Around him, the other cadets were similarly captivated. This was history, real history, not something from a textbook, but something lived and survived. "On the 7th day, Hartford continued, "we had a casualty, not as dramatic as your drill today, but serious enough. A cooling pump failed in the reactor compartment. We had maybe 6 hours before the reactor would automatically scram, shutting down all our power, leaving us dead in the water in Soviet territorial seas." He took another sip of coffee, his face thoughtful. "The chief engineer told me we had 2 choices. We could surface, which meant abandoning the mission, revealing our position, and potentially starting an international incident that could escalate into war, or we could try to fix it while maintaining position and depth, which meant putting crew members in danger and risking a reactor emergency if something went wrong." The mess had gone completely silent. Even the usual background noise of the submarine seemed to have faded away, leaving only the Admiral's voice and the weight of his words. "I chose to fix it," Hartford said. "I put my chief engineer and 3 of his best people into the reactor compartment, and we stayed deep, stayed quiet while they worked. It took them 4.5 hours. 4.5 hours of wondering if I'd just ordered good people to their deaths for the sake of a mission that might not even matter in the long run." He set down his coffee cup, his weathered hands steady on the table. "They fixed it. We completed the patrol, got the intelligence we needed, and made it home. The chief engineer got a commendation, the crew got promoted, and I got to live with the knowledge that I'd gambled with people's lives and gotten lucky. Martinez felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't just a story about submarine operations. This was a lesson about command, about the weight of decisions, about the reality that sometimes there were no good choices, only necessary ones. That chief engineer, Admiral Hartford, said, looking around at the gathered cadets. His name was Robert Chen. Some of you might have heard of him. He went on to become an admiral himself, designed the reactor systems for the Virginia-class boats. Brilliant man, and 30 years later, at a reunion, he told me something I've never forgotten. The admiral's eyes swept across the young faces watching him. He said that he'd known all along how dangerous that repair was. He'd known the odds of success were maybe 50-50 at best, but he also knew that I trusted him to make the right call, to speak up if he thought it was impossible, and that trust, that respect, that made him willing to risk everything. Martinez couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his rack, listening to the constant background hum of the submarine systems, thinking about Admiral Hartford's story, about the drill, about everything that had happened since that moment on the first day, when he'd laughed at an old man in a windbreaker. The submarine ran through the dark waters on autopilot, the crew settling into the rhythm of watch rotations and maintenance schedules that would define their lives for the next 6 months. Somewhere in the forward compartments, sonar operators were listening to the ocean's secrets. In the engine room, technicians were monitoring temperatures and pressures that kept them all alive, and Martinez was lying in the dark, finally beginning to understand just how much he had to learn. He got up quietly, not wanting to disturb the other cadets sleeping in nearby racks, and made his way through the dim passages to the control room. The night watch crew was there, moving with quiet efficiency, their faces illuminated by the glow of instruments and displays. Martinez found Admiral Hartford standing near the periscope station, hands clasped behind his back, watching the crew work. The old man looked tired, the lines in his face deeper in the low light, but his eyes were still sharp, still taking in everything. Martinez approached slowly, unsure if he should interrupt, but Hartford noticed him and nodded slightly, a gesture that was both acknowledgement and invitation. They stood together in silence for a while, watching the submarine do what submarines did best, disappear into the ocean's vastness and become a ghost. Finally, Martinez spoke, keeping his voice low so it wouldn't carry. "Sir, I wanted to apologize, for the first day, for laughing, for being disrespectful." Admiral Hartford was quiet for a moment, his eyes still on the crew. Then he turned to look at Martinez directly. "Why are you apologizing?" The question caught Martinez off guard. "Because it was wrong, sir. Because I judged you based on appearances instead of substance. Because I acted like an ignorant fool." The Admiral's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "All true," he said, "but that's not why you're apologizing, is it?" Martinez felt something uncomfortable shift in his chest. "I don't understand." Hartford turned back to watch the crew. "You're apologizing because you got caught, because your commanding officer called you out, because you're embarrassed." He paused. "Those are all valid reasons, but they're not the right reason." He gestured at the control room, at the crew members moving through their tasks with practiced precision. "Every single person on this boat has made mistakes, some bigger than yours, some smaller. The question isn't whether you make mistakes. The question is what you learn from." Martinez thought about that, about the drill, about the story of the Pittsburgh, about all the moments over the past few days that had been designed to teach him something. What should I have learned? The Admiral was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Martinez wondered if he'd overstepped by asking. But then Hartford spoke, his gravelly voice carrying a weight of experience that made every word feel important. "You should have learned that everyone you meet knows something you don't. That experience counts for something, that the uniform doesn't make you special, it makes you responsible." He turned to look at Martinez again. "And you should have learned that real leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room, or having the perfect record. It's about recognizing value in others, even when it doesn't come in the package you expect." 6 months later, the USS Virginia returned to Pearl Harbor. Martinez stood on the deck as the submarine surfaced, watching the Hawaiian coastline appear on the horizon, feeling the sun on his face after weeks of fluorescent lighting and recycled air. He was different now, not just older, not just more experienced, but fundamentally changed in ways that were hard to articulate, but impossible to deny. The patrol had been intense, filled with challenges both expected and surprising, moments of boredom punctuated by stretches of high-stakes tension that tested every skill he possessed. Admiral Hartford had been there through all of it, observing, occasionally commenting, but mostly just being a steady presence that reminded them all what decades of service looked like. The old man had taught them things that weren't in any manual, lessons about leadership and humility and the importance of respecting the knowledge that came before you. He'd shown them how to read the ocean like a language, how to anticipate problems before they became crises, how to lead through example rather than authority, and perhaps most importantly, he'd shown them that there was always more to learn, that even after 42 years of service he still approached each day with curiosity and willingness to adapt. As the submarine docked and the crew prepared to disembark, Captain Diaz gathered the cadets one final time. Admiral Hartford stood beside her, his duffel bag once again hanging from one weathered hand, looking exactly as he had that first day, except for one crucial difference. Now they all saw him clearly. "Admiral Hartford will be departing with you," Captain Diaz said. "His assessment of this crew and this patrol will help shape training protocols for future deployments. I want to thank him for his service, both past and present." The cadets came to attention as one, their movements synchronized in a way they hadn't been 6 months ago. Martis felt a tightness in his chest as Admiral Hartford stepped forward. The old man's eyes moved across their faces, and Martinez could see him taking measure one last time, seeing how they'd changed, seeing what they'd become. "You did well," Hartford said, his gravelly voice carrying across the deck. "You came aboard as cadets, unsure and untested. You leave as sailors, ready to serve." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. "Some of you will go on to command your own boats one day. Some will teach the next generation. All of you will carry forward the lessons learned on this patrol. Remember them. Remember that service isn't about glory or recognition. It's about doing the hard things when no one is watching, making the right choices even when they're difficult, and respecting the wisdom of those who came before you." Martinez found himself blinking hard, refusing to let the emotion show too clearly. Around him, other cadets were having similar struggles. Admiral Hartford gave them one final nod, then turned and made his way toward the gangway. Martinez watched him go, this man who had seemed so unremarkable that first day, who had taught them more in 6 months than 4 years at Annapolis had managed. As Hartford reached the gangway, he paused and looked back. His eyes found Martinez in the crowd, and he gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Martinez snapped to attention, and rendered a salute that was as crisp and perfect as any he'd ever given. The Admiral returned it, then disappeared into the morning light. 2 years later, Martinez would find himself back at Pearl Harbor, this time as part of a training cadre responsible for incoming cadets on their first submarine deployment. He would watch them board with the same mixture of arrogance and ignorance he'd once possessed, and he would remember an old man in a windbreaker who had taught him what it really meant to serve. And when those new cadets inevitably made their own mistakes, judged people by appearances, thought they knew more than they did, Martinez would think of Admiral Hartford and find the patience to teach them what he'd learned. That wisdom came in unexpected packages. That respect was earned through action, not demanded through rank, and that the best leaders were often the ones who looked least like what you expected, who taught through example rather than lecture, who understood that every sailor, no matter how junior or senior, had something valuable to contribute if you were willing to listen. The submarine service would continue generation after generation, each one learning from the last, each one passing forward the lessons that kept them alive in the dark depths. And somewhere in that chain of knowledge, in that unbroken line of service and sacrifice, would be the memory of an elderly admiral who boarded a submarine in civilian clothes and reminded a group of arrogant cadets what humility looked like.